The scent of lemon polish in her father's office, usually a comforting aroma of his diligence, now smelled like decay. It clung to the legal documents fanned across his mahogany desk, each one a tombstone for a different dream. Amina Johnson stood before that desk, the vibrant colors of her paint-splattered jeans and her favorite sunflower yellow sweater a jarring contrast to the gray despair leaching from the room. Her father, the unshakable Robert Johnson, sat with his shoulders hunched, a man physically diminished overnight. "It's not just the business, baby girl," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper that scraped at her heart. "It's the personal guarantees. The house. The medical bills from your mother's last year." He didn't need to finish. Amina saw the truth in the tremor of his hand, in the sheen of perspiration on his temple despite the room's chill. The landscape architecture firm she was painstakingly building, her fledgling dreams of transforming urban spaces into green sanctuaries, suddenly felt like a childish fantasy. The family home in Chicago's South Shore, filled with the laughter of generations, was no longer a sanctuary but an asset with a looming expiration date. "There is a proposal," he continued, the words seeming to physically pain him. He slid a single crisp sheet of paper toward her. It was not a loan application. The heading was stark: Confidential Matrimonial Agreement. Amina laughed, a short, brittle sound. "Dad, what is this? A reality TV show pitch?" Her laughter died as she saw his expression. She picked up the paper. The legal language was dense, but the terms were brutally clear. A 2-year marriage of convenience to one Min-jun Park, CEO of Pionex Technologies, Seoul. In exchange, all of Robert Johnson's debts would be assumed and cleared, the family home retained, and a substantial, separate trust established for Amina's use. A non-disclosure agreement was woven through the clauses like barbed wire. The compensation for her role as a wife was listed with the cold precision of a salary schedule. A trillionaire? Amina breathed, the term feeling alien on her tongue. Why? Why would someone like that need this? Her mind conjured images of a lecherous old man, a figure of grotesque power playing a cruel game. His representative said it's about corporate stability. Legacy. A public image for a very private man. There's a major merger pending with a conservative family-run conglomerate. A wife completes a picture. Her father's eyes were pools of shame. I said no. At first. But the calls from the creditors, the notice from the bank. Amina looked from her father's broken posture to the document. It was a transaction. A ledger. On one side, her freedom, her autonomy, the very concept of love. On the other, her father's health, her family's history, their future. The math was monstrous, but it was undeniable. "What's he like?" she asked, her voice hollow. Her father could only hand her a sealed dossier. Inside were a few public, grainy photos. A man in his early 30s with an unervingly sharp gaze, seated in a sleek, titanium-framed wheelchair at various galas, his expression one of detached frost. A brief bio noted a car accident years prior that had left him with a spinal cord injury. Reclusive, demanding, a genius with a ruthless streak, the scant article said. A gulf of understanding opened within her. It wasn't just an old man's whim. It was a strategic alliance. She, Amina, with her passion for growth and life, was to be a living prop for a man imprisoned by his own wealth and a wheelchair. The irony was a bitter pill. For a week she fought it. She raged, she cried, she researched bankruptcy law until her eyes burned. But every path led to a cliff's edge. The thought of her father losing the home where her mother's memory lived in every creak of the floorboard, the thought of his stress-induced condition worsening, it was a slow-motion collapse she was powerless to stop. Powerless unless she signed. She signed the document on a rainy Tuesday morning. Her signature, usually a flowing, confident script, looked small and trapped. She was not a bride preparing for her wedding. She was a soldier conscripted into a silent war, her weapons her dignity and her time. She packed a single large suitcase, her portfolio of garden designs tucked carefully between folded sweaters, a tiny piece of her true self she refused to leave behind. On the flight to Seoul, as Chicago disappeared beneath a blanket of clouds, Amina made a vow. She would honor this contract. She would be the composed, acceptable wife. But she would not give him her heart. She would not let the gilded cage smother the person she was. She would tend to the garden of her own spirit, even in barren soil. The ledger was set. Her life was now measured in months, not moments. And the first entry was a debt of self, paid in full. Seoul rose from the tarmac like a city of living circuits, a breathtaking symphony of glass, steel, and relentless light. From the window of the obsidian-black town car sent for her, Amina watched it all flow past in a silent, mesmerizing stream. The vibrant, chaotic energy of Myeongdong, the serene grandeur of palaces against skyscrapers. It was a world alive with a pulse she could feel through the car's insulated doors. Yet, with every mile, the weight in her chest, the cold ledger of the contract, grew heavier, separating her from the life outside. The car did not take her to a hotel or a bustling downtown apartment. It climbed, winding its way up a secluded, pine-lined road in the prestigious foothills of Bukhansan National Park. The urban spectacle fell away, replaced by a hushed, almost sacred quiet. Finally, wrought iron gates, minimalist and imposing, slid open without a sound. The estate was not a house, it was a statement. A masterpiece of contemporary Korean architecture, soaring lines of pale stone, vast plains of flawless glass that mirrored the sky and the disciplined perfection of the surrounding gardens. It was stunning and it was utterly sterile. Not a single leaf seemed out of place, not one curve appeared unplanned. It felt less like a home and more like a museum exhibit titled, Controlled Opulence. A uniformed, unsmiling steward met her at the entrance, conveying her luggage with an efficiency that bordered on telepathy. Inside, the air was cool, scentless, filtered. The silence was a physical presence, broken only by the soft, mournful sigh of central air and the distant, rhythmic click of her own heels on the polished ondal floor. The interior was a study in monochrome, shades of charcoal, dove gray, and stark white. There were no personal photographs, no cluttered shelves, no splash of accidental color. Her sunflower sweater felt like a screaming intrusion. She was shown to her rooms, a suite, vast and beautiful, with a breathtaking panoramic view of the city in the distance. A prison with a view. Her belongings had already been unpacked, her clothes hung with regimented spacing in a walk-in closet larger than her Chicago bedroom. The order was oppressive. "He will see you in the library at 7 o'clock, the steward said, his English precise. It was not an invitation. It was a summons. The hours until 7 stretched like taffy. Amina wandered the suite, tracing a finger over the cool marble surfaces. She ended up at the window, watching the sunset bleed over the Han River, feeling a loneliness so acute it vibrated in her bones. This was the price. This magnificent, empty silence. At precisely 6:59 p.m., she stood before the double doors of the library, having been directed there by a different, equally silent staff member. She wore simple black trousers and a cream silk blouse, armor she hoped. She took a deep breath, pushed the door open, and entered. The library was a cathedral of knowledge, all dark wood and soft, golden light from linear LEDs. And there, in the center of the room, silhouetted against the last of the twilight sky through a floor-to-ceiling window, was Min-jun Park. He was both exactly and nothing like his photos. The sharp, intelligent eyes were the same, taking her in with a dispassionate, analytical sweep that felt more invasive than any stare. He was younger looking in person, but any hint of youth was countermanded by the severe line of his mouth and an aura of coiled intensity that filled the space around him. His hands rested on the arms of his wheelchair, which was a piece of elegant, black-engineered technology, not a medical device. He did not smile. "Miss Johnson, please sit." His voice was a low baritone, cool and smooth as the stone outside. His English was flawless, with only a faint, melodic undertone. He gestured to a chair opposite him, not a sofa, maintaining a clear distance. "Amina, please," she said, forcing her voice to steadiness as she sat. "Given the circumstances." A flicker in his eyes, there and gone. "Very well, Amina. I trust your journey was adequate. Your quarters are acceptable?" "More than acceptable. They're very beautiful." The word beautiful felt wrong. It was all beautiful and utterly soulless. "Good. This will be your primary residence for the duration of our agreement. You have the freedom of the main house and the south gardens. The east wing contains my offices and private labs. Those areas are restricted. My staff will attend to all your material needs. In public you will be Mrs. Park. Our interactions will be cordial and respectful. We will present a unified front." He spoke like he was reviewing a project brief. Amina felt a spark of defiance ignite in her chest, cutting through the numbness. "And in private?" "In private," he said, his gaze not wavering from hers, "we will fulfill the terms outlined. Discretion is paramount. Your role is to manage the household's social profile and to be seen as my wife. Nothing more, nothing less is required. Nothing more, nothing less." The phrase sealed the tomb. He was buying a function, not a partner. The physical fact of his wheelchair was somehow both central to the arrangement and completely beside the point of his demeanor. His power and his isolation were communicated not by the chair, but by the imperious, walled-off fortress of his person. "What about my work? My own projects?" she asked, clutching at a thread of her old self. A faint, almost imperceptible frown. "Your financial needs are provided for. Pursuing a landscaping hobby on the estate would be a distraction. It is unnecessary." A hobby. The dismissal was so complete it stole her breath. Her passion, her degree, her vision, reduced to a triviality. The meeting lasted 10 more clinical minutes. Schedules, introductions to a personal assistant who would manage her calendar, security protocols. It was a corporate onboarding for the most intimate of frauds. When she was dismissed, and it was a dismissal, Amina walked back to her suite through the hushed, gleaming corridors. The grandeur pressed in on her. She was a piece of art he had acquired, a living sculpture to be placed in the correct light. The cage was not just gilded, it was hermetically sealed. As she closed the door to her room, the profound silence of the estate settled around her once more, a constant reminder of the stark, lonely ledger she had chosen. The second entry was written, a withdrawal of hope, leaving a balance of sheer willful endurance. The silence of the estate became a texture, a substance Amina moved through each day. It was in the whisper of her slippers on the floors, the soft hum of the elevator that connected the levels, the mute efficiency of the staff who appeared and vanished like ghosts attending to a mausoleum. Her calendar, managed by the impeccably polite but distant assistant Choi, was a barren landscape of etiquette lessons, refined, useless, and appointments with designers for a wardrobe she did not choose. Min-jun was a ghost in his own home. She caught glimpses of him, the back of his wheelchair disappearing down a corridor, the reflection of his profile in a window as his car departed for Pyenix headquarters, always at dawn. Their paths crossed at precisely 7 p.m. for dinner in the formal dining room, a cavernous space where the clink of silverware against porcelain was the only conversation. He asked after her day with detached politeness. She gave answers as brief and polished as the surfaces around them. The ledger, it seemed, was a closed book to him, the terms settled. Amina felt herself beginning to dissolve into the monochrome. Her sunflower sweater stayed folded in a drawer, a relic of a brighter world. The vibrant, dirt under her fingernails woman from Chicago was fading, being painted over in shades of beige and compliance. It was on a gray afternoon, a week into her captivity, that she found it. Wandering the permitted South Gardens, which were really just another expression of controlled nature, pristine raked gravel, precisely sculpted pines, azaleas trimmed into obedient mounds, she felt a familiar, desperate itch in her hands. She needed to feel something, to connect, to nurture. This curated perfection was suffocating. Pushing past a seemingly decorative screen of bamboo at the garden's far southern edge, she found a rusted wrought iron gate, almost swallowed by an overgrown thicket of wisteria. It was locked, but the ancient latch gave way with a firm, rusty shriek that sounded like freedom. She slipped through. The air changed. It was mustier, richer, alive. She stood in a forgotten walled garden, a square of chaos amidst the estate's order. It was a graveyard of old ambitions, a collapsed pergola entangled with skeletal vines, the dry basin of a stone fountain choked with weeds, flower beds that were now massing graves for hardy, tenacious wildflowers fighting through the neglect. In the center, a gnarled, ancient plum tree stood sentinel, its branches a black lattice against the sky. Her heart did not just beat, it sang. Here was life, untamed and struggling. Here was a project, a truth. No one had cared for this space in years, perhaps since before Min-jun's accident. It was outside the bounds, unseen. The next day she enlisted the baffled but obliging help of a young groundskeeper, Ji-hoon, who seemed thrilled by the break in routine. She didn't ask permission. She simply began. She wore her oldest jeans, now authentically stained. She cleared the crumbling debris with her own hands, feeling the satisfying ache in her muscles, the grit of real soil under her nails. She saved the wildflowers, carefully transplanting the most resilient to a new bed. She pruned the dead wood from the plum tree with a reverence she hadn't felt since arriving. She was unaware that her rebellion was not entirely unseen. In the East Wing, in a room lit by the soft glow of a dozen data streams, Min-jun Park paused in his review of a quantum computing schematic. A discrete alert on a secondary monitor, one of hundreds tied to the estate's security grid, had pinged. Not a breach but an anomaly in a disused sector. He clicked the feed. The high-resolution camera, hidden in the foliage opposite the gate, showed a live image. It was her, Amina. Kneeling in the dirt, her hair tied up in a messy knot, a smudge of earth on her cheek. She was wrestling with a stubborn root, her face a canvas of concentration, frustration, and then triumphant joy as it gave way. She sat back on her heels, looked up at the plum tree with a smile so unguarded, so utterly real, that it struck him with a physical force. He had seen her polite masks at dinner, the composed blankness she wore like the clothes his assistants selected. This was someone else. This woman was alive with a vitality that seemed to radiate from the screen. She wasn't just tending plants, she was communing with them, speaking softly to the soil as she worked. A strange, unfamiliar sensation twisted in his chest. Annoyance? Intrigue? She was violating the unspoken rules of his ordered world, introducing chaos. He should call Assistant Choi, have the gate locked, put a stop to this unsanctioned activity. It was a distraction, an unpredictable variable. His finger hovered over the intercom button. On the screen, she brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving another streak of dirt. She laughed, a soundless puff of air visible in the cool afternoon, at a ladybug that had landed on her hand. The simple, private joy of it was a language he had forgotten. Min-jun leaned back in his chair, the schematic forgotten. He did not press the intercom. Instead, he minimized the security feed, only to find himself reopening it a few minutes later. And again after his next meeting. He watched, a silent, conflicted witness to her quiet rebellion. The sterile ledger of their arrangement had no column for this. The unexpected cost of seeing someone's authentic self, and the unsettling realization that the walls he'd built to keep the world out might also be the walls that kept him imprisoned. The garden was not the only thing being uncovered. The silent observation became a ritual. Each afternoon, after the last of his overseas video conferences concluded, Min-jun would open the security feed. It was a breach of his own principles, a frivolous expenditure of time his schedule did not account for. Yet, he found himself cataloging her progress not as a security concern, but with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a novel ecosystem. He saw her recruit Ji-hoon more formally, their interactions a warm, easy collaboration that stood in stark contrast to the hierarchical stiffness of his own world. He watched her sketch in a large notebook, her brow furrowed in thought, then transformed those sketches into reality, clearing the fountain basin, propping up the pergola with temporary supports, carefully weeding around the surviving perennials. She brought a battered portable speaker, and sometimes if the wind was right through his open window, he could catch the faintest echo of her music, jazzy, soulful, alive. The dirt was a constant on her clothes, her skin. Her smiles, directed at a sprouting seed or a rehomed earthworm, were private treasures he felt guilty for stealing. The sterile, perfect narrative of their contractual marriage felt increasingly like a lie when contrasted with this vibrant, messy truth unfolding in the forgotten square. The catalyst was a plant. He recognized it from the extensive digital botanical archives he'd once referenced for a biotech investment. A Hanabusia asiatica, a rare Korean bellflower, struggling in the dense, nutrient-poor clay at the garden's edge. In her sketchbook scans, which he had, with a pang of guilt, accessed via the estate's network, she had circled it with a question mark in the note. Acidic? Needs drainage? A strange impulse took hold, an urge to participate in the silent dialogue she was having with the land. It was not sentiment. It was problem-solving. She had identified an issue, he possessed a resource. It was a logical transaction, he told himself. 2 days later, a small, unmarked bag appeared on the wrought iron table in her private sitting room. It was not delivered by a staff member. It was simply there when she returned from her garden work. Inside was a premium, pH-balancing soil amendment, precisely the type needed for acid-loving plants like the bellflower. Accompanying it was a single crisp printout, a data sheet on the Hanabusia asiatica, its native habitat, soil preferences and bloom cycle. No note. No signature. Amina stared at the bag, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was not from Ji-hoon. This was a message. He was watching. The knowledge should have felt like a violation, a chilling intrusion. And part of it did. But a larger, more persistent part of her focused on the care of the offering. The specificity. The silent acknowledgement of her work. It was the first thing he had ever given her that wasn't a contractual obligation. It was a response. That evening, dinner held a new, electric charge. The usual silence felt different, laden with unspoken words. She waited until the main course was served, the staff having retreated. The soil amendment, she said, her voice steady, cutting through the quiet. Thank you. Min-jun's chopsticks paused mid-air for a fraction of a second. He did not look up from his plate. I noticed an inefficiency in the garden's composition. It was a logical remedy. It was she agreed, a tiny spark of courage igniting. But logic doesn't usually extend to forgotten walled gardens. Or rare bellflowers. Now he looked at her. His dark eyes held hers, and for the first time she saw not just calculation, but a flicker of something else, curiosity perhaps, or the faintest trace of embarrassment at being caught in his act of observation. You are utilizing estate resources. It is in my interest to see they are used effectively. Is that all it is? The question hung between them, daring. He set his chopsticks down. The silence stretched, but it was no longer empty. It was full of the images of her kneeling in the dirt, of him studying botanical data sheets. The garden was my mother's, he said, the words seeming to emerge against his will. She was fond of chaotic growth. The estate managers were instructed to seal it after her passing. They saw it as a disorderly element. The revelation was a seismic shift. This was not just a forgotten plot, it was a sealed memory. And he had not only watched her unseal it, he had handed her the key to nurture it back. It's not chaotic, Amina said softly, meeting his gaze. It's resilient. It's waiting. There's a difference. He studied her, truly studied her, as if seeing the woman from the garden feed superimposed over the composed woman at his table. The smudges of dirt were gone, but the light in her eyes was the same. You see a difference, he stated. I do. Chaos is without intent. This is life persisting. It has a purpose. To grow. To bloom again. The ghost of something, not a smile but a softening at the corners of his eyes, touched his face. And you are its instrument. I'd like to be, she said, holding her breath. Another long pause. Then a single slow nod. Very well. You may continue. Ji-hoon will be reassigned to assist you fully. Submit any required materials to Assistant Choi. It was permission. But it felt like something far more significant. An acknowledgement. A first, fragile bridge built not from words, but from observed action and a bag of soil. The ledger of their contract gained a new, unclassifiable column. The entry was not a debit or a credit, but a question mark. And for the first time since she arrived, the crushing silence of the gilded cage was replaced by the hum of a silent, mutual understanding. The conversation had begun, and it had nothing to do with words. The formal permission changed everything and nothing. Ji-hoon, now her official and enthusiastically chatty assistant, helped source materials with glee. Bags of mulch, reclaimed timber for the pergola, native wildflower seeds. The requests Amina submitted to Assistant Choi were approved without comment, often within the hour. The garden was no longer a secret rebellion but a sanctioned project, yet the space itself remained their silent, neutral territory. They did not visit it together. Their communication was still the evening meal and the language of logistics. Then came the storm. It began as a low, grumbling promise in the late afternoon, the sky deepening to a bruised purple. By dinner, the first fat drops were smearing the panoramic dining room windows. The forecast, which Min-jun referenced with a glance at his tablet, warned of a severe cell moving directly over the mountain. Winds were predicted to exceed 100 kilometers per hour. The backup generators will engage automatically if needed, he said, as if reading a technical manual. The estate is designed for such events. You should retire to your quarters. The east-facing windows have the best reinforcement. His tone was dismissive, a CEO ensuring asset safety. Amina nodded, but a knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. It wasn't the storm she feared, it was the image of him alone in the vast, darkening compound, the hum of his wheelchair's battery, the labyrinth of halls if the power failed. The clinical estate was a marvel of engineering, but in a true emergency, how many barriers became traps? She went to her room, but as the wind began to howl, a primal shriek against the glass, she couldn't stay. The lights flickered once, twice, and died, plunging the world into a roaring ink-black chaos. The emergency lights in the hallway sputtered on, casting long, frantic shadows. The elegant hum of the estate was replaced by the violent symphony of the gale. Her first thought was not for herself. It was for him. She grabbed the heavy flashlight from her emergency kit, its beam a shaky sword cutting through the dark. The hallways, once familiar in their sterile order, were now a disorienting maze of echoes and groaning structural stress. She knew his private study was in the east wing, the restricted zone. Tonight, rules were meaningless. She found the door to the connecting corridor locked as expected. But fear and determination lent her strength. A fire axe behind glass, another piece of perfect, unnoticed estate planning, became her key. The shatter was lost in the storm's cacophony. When she finally reached the door to his study, it was ajar. Inside, the scene was not one of helplessness. The glow of a satellite phone screen illuminated his face, sharp and focused. He was speaking in rapid, calm Korean, directing someone, his security chief perhaps, on contingency plans. A battery-powered lantern cast a pool of steady light around his chair. He was, as ever, in command. He looked up as her flashlight beam crossed the threshold. In the stark, bouncing light, his expression was one of pure, unguarded shock. Not annoyance. Not anger. Astonishment. Amina? His voice cut through his phone conversation. He said something sharp in Korean and ended the call. What are you doing? The East Wing is unsafe, I know, she finished, breathless, her hair wild from the wind in the corridors, her hand still gripping the axe handle. I heard. I didn't know if, she trailed off, suddenly feeling foolish. He was clearly in control, a captain on a steady bridge while she was a drowned rat clutching a weapon. He took in her appearance, the panic in her eyes, the determination in her stance, the absurd, heroic acts. The cold efficiency drained from his face, replaced by a dawning, profound comprehension. She had fought her way through a dark, storm-savaged house to reach him. Not because the contract required it. Not for any logical, strategic reason. But because, on a fundamental human level, she had been worried for him. You were concerned, he said, the words not a question but a slow, careful realization. The simple statement deflated her. She lowered the axe, leaning it against the doorframe. The power was out. I just wanted to make sure you were all right. The storm raged outside, shaking the very foundations of his meticulously engineered world. But inside the study, a different kind of quiet settled. The pretense of employer and employee, of contractor and asset, was stripped away by the primal darkness. Here they were just two people. I am all right, he said, and his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. The generators will restore main power in approximately 20 minutes. Come. Sit. He gestured to a chair near his desk, not the distant, formal seating of the library. She sat, the adrenaline ebbing, leaving her trembling. He reached into a compartment on his chair and produced a foil blanket, the kind used in emergencies. He handed it to her. You are shivering. She wrapped it around her shoulders, its crinkling sound a strange comfort. In the lantern's glow, with the world screaming outside, the usual walls were impossible to maintain. You know, she said after a moment, her voice small, in Chicago during a storm like this my mom would make cinnamon toast. The whole house would smell like it. It made the thunder feel less scary. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the rain streak the windows like tears. My mother, he said, would play the Gaiageum. She said the strings could tune out any discord, even that of the weather. He didn't look at her. I have not heard it in many years. It was a offering, a tiny piece of personal history laid bare. No corporate strategy, no botanical data. Just a memory of comfort. They sat in the lantern-lit bubble as the storm peaked and began to slowly relent. They didn't speak of contracts or gardens. They spoke of childhood fears, of favorite books, of the absurdity of feeling safe in a spaceship-themed bed, him, or needing a specific tattered quilt, her. The conversation was a fragile, meandering thing, a bridge built in real time over the chasm of their arranged lives. When the lights suddenly blazed back on, the moment shattered. The estate's heartbeat, the hum of electricity, returned, and with it the reality of their roles. They blinked in the sudden brightness, the intimacy of the dark retreating. But it didn't vanish. It lingered in the space between them in the way he didn't immediately retreat back into his CEO persona. He looked at her, really looked, and she saw not the Trillionaire, nor the crippled heir, but Min-jun. A man who remembered his mother's music. Thank you, Amina, he said, the use of her name carrying a new weight. For your concern. She stood, the foil blanket slipping from her shoulders. You're welcome, Min-jun. She left the study, walking back through the now lit, orderly halls. The storm outside was passing, but a different kind of turbulence had been unleashed within. The ledger was irrevocably altered. A new, profound entry had been made, a deposit of something perilously close to care, made in the currency of shared darkness and cinnamon toast. The storm had changed the atmospheric pressure inside the estate. The silence that followed was no longer empty, but charged with a new, unspoken awareness. Their dinners were still mostly quiet, but the glances held a second longer. A question about her garden's progress was no longer a perfunctory check on an asset, but carried a genuine note of interest. He began to mention in his clipped way, articles on sustainable irrigation or rare succulents he'd come across in his tech journals. It was their language, a dialect of soil and data. The first major test of their nascent, fragile alliance arrived with a thick, cream-colored invitation. The Park Gallery was hosting an exhibition of contemporary Korean minimalist art, and their presence as a newly married couple was not just requested, it was a corporate and social imperative. The merger with the traditional, family-run Daesung group was entering its most sensitive phase. Image was everything. Amina felt a familiar dread, colder and sharper than before. This wasn't just performing for staff in a quiet house. This was the opening night of their farce on the world stage. Assistant Choi and a team of stylists descended, transforming her into a version of Mrs. Park. The gown was a masterpiece of liquid midnight silk, elegant and severe. The jewelry was heirloom pieces, cold, beautiful diamonds that felt like shackles. Looking in the mirror, she saw a stranger, a beautiful mannequin perfectly accessorizing the formidable Min-jun Park. The night of the event, he met her in the grand foyer. He was in an impeccably tailored black tuxedo, his chair seeming less a mobility aid and more a throne on wheels. His eyes swept over her, and for a fleeting moment, the impassive mask slipped, revealing a flicker of something akin to awe, quickly schooled into cool appraisal. "You look appropriate," he said, the clinical word a small betrayal of the warmth she'd glimpsed in the storm-dark study. "Thank you," she replied, her voice tight. "I feel like a window display." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Then we shall be a matched set. Remember, we are a united front. Confidence is the only required performance." The gallery was a temple of white walls, polished concrete, and the low, reverent murmur of Seoul's elite. The spotlight was on them from the moment they crossed the threshold. Amina felt the weight of 100 assessing stares, heard the whispers that hung in the air like smoke. The contract bride. The reclusive trillionaire. A business arrangement, obviously. Min-jun's hand found the small of her back, a light, guiding pressure. It was the first intentional touch of their marriage that wasn't a sterile handshake. It was steadying. "Stay close," he murmured, his public smile fixed and polite. They moved through the crowd, a slow, regal procession. He introduced her with a simple, "My wife, Amina." She responded with practiced grace, discussing the art with intelligent, if generic, remarks she'd memorized, feeling like a parrot in pearls. She watched him, this master of his universe, command the room with a few quiet words, his disability rendered irrelevant by the sheer force of his presence. Yet, she saw the slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible strain. This was his battlefield, and even he found it exhausting. It was during a conversation with a cluster of Daesung board members and their wives that the blow landed. An older man, Chairman Go, a friend of Min-jun's late father, was holding forth. His eyes slid from Min-jun's face to his wheelchair and back with a patronizing gleam. "And of course, Min-jun, it is so good to see you out and about," Chairman Go said, his tone dripping with false warmth. "And with such devoted companionship. One worries, after such a tragic setback, that life becomes limited. It is a comfort to your investors to see you well supported." The air turned to ice. The subtle insult, the implication that Min-jun was limited, that Amina was a hired support system, hung in the space between them. The Daesung heirs looked faintly embarrassed. Their wives studied their champagne flutes. Min-jun's expression didn't change, but Amina felt the muscle in his back tense under her hand. He was preparing a cold, cutting retort, one that would win the point but cement a rift. Amina acted on pure instinct. Before he could speak, she took a half step forward, her smile not wavering but deepening, turning sharp. "Chairman Go," she said, her voice clear and carrying a melodic warmth that belied the steel beneath. "What a fascinating perspective. I've always found that true vision isn't limited by the physical, but expanded by the mind. Min-jun's work at Pionex is redefining connectivity for the entire world. It's those of us who can only see the chair and not the genius it carries, who have the real limitations, don't you think?" She let the question hang, sweet as poison. Then, without breaking eye contact with the stunned chairman, she gently placed her hand on Min-jun's shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of pity or support. It was a claim. A statement of alliance. A shield. The silence was absolute. Chairman Go's face mottled red. Then one of the younger Daesung heirs coughed, hiding a laugh. The spell broke. Min-jun, beneath her hand, let out a breath so soft only she could hear it. He then seamlessly took the reins, his voice like polished stone. "My wife is too kind. But she understands that at Pionex, we focus on building bridges, not perceiving barriers. Now, if you'll excuse us, the curator wishes to speak with us." He guided her away, his hand coming up to cover hers where it still rested on his shoulder, pressing it briefly, tightly. It was a silent, seismic thank you. For the rest of the evening, a new energy hummed between them. The performance had layers now. The unified front was no longer a facade, it had been forged in fire. In the car home, the dark intimacy of the storm night returned, but now flavored with triumph. He didn't speak until they were back in the foyer, the staff dismissed. He wheeled himself to face her, the grand empty space around them. "What you did tonight," he began, his voice rough. "That was not in the contract." "I know," she whispered. He looked up at her, his eyes searching her face in the dim light. The careful distance was gone. What remained was a raw, vulnerable gratitude and something hotter, more dangerous. Slowly he reached out. She met him halfway. Their embrace was not a hug of passion but of pact. He pulled her close, his arms strong around her waist, her face buried against his shoulder. She held him, feeling the solid strength of his back, the steady beat of his heart against hers. It was a shelter. It was a claiming. It was the silent, physical seal on the alliance they had both chosen in that moment in the gallery. In the echoing silence of the gilded cage, they held on to the one real thing they had built, a mutual ferocious protectiveness. The ledger was now irrelevant. A new document had been signed, not with ink, but with a defiant gesture and a trembling, forever embrace. The morning after the gallery, the estate felt different. The air was not just charged with understanding, but with the indelible memory of the embrace. It lingered in the space between them at breakfast, a soft, humming awareness that made the simple act of passing the soy sauce feel monumental. They didn't speak of it. The hug existed as its own perfect, fragile entity, a bridge they had both crossed but were now standing on, afraid to move for fear it might collapse under the weight of words. Amina threw herself into the garden with renewed vigor. The physicality of the work, the digging, the planting, the hauling, was a welcome outlet for the energy coursing through her. The plum tree was showing its first tentative buds. Ji-hoon, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, worked with cheerful discretion. Meanwhile, Min-jun became more present in the main house. He began taking his afternoon video calls in the sun-drenched conservatory that overlooked the south garden, rather than his sealed east wing office. He claimed it was for the light, but his gaze often drifted to the walled garden's entrance. He didn't visit, but his proximity felt deliberate, a silent acknowledgement of the territory they now shared. A week after the gallery, a crack appeared in the new piece. It was late. Amina, unable to sleep, went to the kitchen for a glass of water. The house was in its nocturnal mode, only safety lights glowing. As she passed the slightly ajar door of his private study in the main wing, a room he'd begun using more frequently, she heard his voice. It was low, fierce, and sharp with a fury she had never witnessed. "Utterly unacceptable. You will retract the request, or I will personally see that the entire audit clause is revisited." Pause. He was on a call. "My personal life is not a line item for the board's scrutiny," he snarled, the venom in his tone making her flinch. "Her background, her suitability, it is not open for discussion. The Daesung merger proceeds on the agreed terms, not on their prurient interest in my marriage." Amina froze, her breath catching. Her background. Her suitability. They were discussing her. Picking her apart as a risk factor. "I don't care if they have doubts," Min-jun's voice cut through the door, colder now, deadlier. "The merger is conditional on their public, unequivocal support of my leadership, and by extension, my household. If they cannot extend that courtesy to my wife, then there is no merger. Am I understood?" The finality in his voice was absolute. He was willing to torch $1 billion deal. For her. The call ended abruptly. In the following silence, Amina heard a sound that shattered her completely, a raw, frustrated expulsion of breath, followed by the soft, helpless thud of a fist meeting padded leather. It was a sound of utter isolation. Without thinking, she pushed the door open. He was silhouetted against the city lights, his back to her, head bowed. The aura of invincible command was gone, replaced by a palpable weariness. "You shouldn't jeopardize your company for me," she said quietly. He started, wheeling around sharply. In the dim light, his face was stripped bare. The anger was still there, but beneath it was a pain so deep it looked like physical wound. "You heard? Enough." He stared at her, his defenses in ruins. The storm had revealed the man. This confrontation revealed the scar. "They see a transaction," he said, his voice rough. "A vulnerability to be exploited. They think you are a temporary fixture. A hired grace note. And you defended the transaction," she stated, stepping into the room. "No," the word was a gunshot. He ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of agitation. I defended you. The silence stretched, taut and vulnerable. The unspoken why hung in the air. He looked away, his jaw tight. The contract, he began, then shook his head, disgusted with his own evasion. The contract was a lie I told myself. A way to control a narrative after I lost control of everything else. He met her eyes then, and the floodgates opened. The accident wasn't just an accident. I was driving. My best friend, my business partner, was in the passenger seat. We were arguing. He was diverting funds, making side deals. I looked away from the road for a second to confront him. That was all it took. The words were clinical, but his eyes were haunted. The crash took my legs. It took his life. The betrayal, the guilt, the loss. It was easier to believe that connection itself was the flaw. That trust was the vulnerability. So I built walls. The marriage contract was the final brick. A business arrangement. No trust required. No heart involved. He looked at her, his gaze searing. And then you arrived. With your dirt and your sunflowers and your relentless, quiet belief that broken things can grow. You fought your way through a storm to check on me. You stood in front of a vulture like Chairman Go for me. You saw the garden, not the seal on the door. His confession hung in the air, a vast, aching truth. I never expected you, Amina, he whispered, the admission costing him everything. I never expected to want to tear down my own walls. Amina stood before him, her own heart a tumultuous storm. The ledger, the transaction, lay in ashes at their feet. Here was the raw, wounded man behind the trillionaire, the cripple, the recluse. He had not just defended her to his board. He had given her the knife to his own vulnerabilities. She didn't move to hug him. The moment was too fragile for that. Instead, she took a final step forward and knelt, putting herself at eye level with his chair, with his pain. Min-jun, she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. You are not the man in that accident. And I am not a temporary fixture. She reached out, slowly, and placed her hand over his where it rested on the arm of his chair. A connection. A grounding wire. The contract is over. Whatever this is, she said, her gaze holding his, we start it now. From here. With the truth. He turned his hand, his fingers lacing through hers, a desperate, grateful clasp. The wound was open, raw, and exposed. But for the first time he was not alone with it. She was there not as a hired wife but as a witness. And in that shared, painful truth, something new and terrifyingly real began finally to grow. The truth, once spoken, became the new foundation. The sterile pretense of the contract was swept away, leaving a raw, open space that was both terrifying and liberating. They were no longer bound by clauses but by a choice to see each other truly for the first time. In the days that followed, a subtle but profound transformation reshaped the estate. It began with small things. Min-jun no longer took his meals in the formal dining room. They ate in the sunlit morning room where the table was smaller, the chairs closer. The conversations were halting at first, conversations not between a billionaire and his bride, but between Min-jun and Amina. He asked about her favorite projects in Chicago. She asked about his early days at Pionex before the weight of legacy and tragedy. They discovered a shared, dry sense of humor, and the sound of his genuine low laugh became her new favorite sound. But the most significant change was in the architecture of their shared life. Amina, with her designer's eye and her newfound understanding, saw the estate anew. It wasn't a home, it was a fortress designed by a man who believed he needed one. And she decided, quietly but determinedly, to turn it into an invitation. She started not with grand declarations, but with observation and action. She noticed the slight incline to the library's patio that made him rely on a different, motorized attachment for his chair. One afternoon, a team of workers arrived and installed a seamless, subtle ramp alongside the stone steps, blending so perfectly it looked original. She said nothing about it. The next evening, he wheeled onto the patio to join her for tea, his path smooth and unassisted. He paused at the top of the ramp, his hand resting on its sleek metal edge. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. The moss between the stones was becoming a slipping hazard, she said simply, stirring her tea. This seemed more practical. A small, grateful smile touched his lips. He understood. It was not an accommodation for weakness. It was an engineering solution for equality. This became their silent project. She redesigned the cramped, picturesque herb garden near the kitchen, widening the crushed gravel paths so his chair could navigate them easily, raising the planting beds to a height where they could both tend to the rosemary and thyme without strain. She presented him with the plans for the unseen bridge garden, the forgotten walled garden now reimagined. The design included wide, meandering flagstone paths, a raised central water feature he could touch, and a variety of sensory plants chosen for scent and texture, all arranged so every vista could be enjoyed from a sitting position. "It's a collaboration," she said, spreading the sketches on the table between them. "Your knowledge of systems, my knowledge of growth. This shouldn't be my garden or your mother's garden. It should be ours. A place that works, for us." He studied the drawings, his fingers tracing the lines of the proposed ramps, the notation for aromatic jasmine, the shaded bench beneath the plum tree. His throat worked. "It is perfectly considered," he managed, his voice thick. The construction of the garden became their shared purpose. He, the master of logistics and technology, handled the material sourcing, the lighting plans, the subtle integration of accessible irrigation systems. She, the artist of life, directed the planting, the color palettes, the play of light and shadow. They spent hours there together, not just as supervisor and designer but as partners. He would hold a level while she marked a path. She would ask his opinion on the sound of different water features. Their hands brushed over soil samples. Their debates over native perennials versus cultivated hybrids were passionate and full of laughter. One cool afternoon, as they supervised the placement of the central stone basin, a sudden spring shower caught them by surprise. Ji-hoon and the workers scattered for cover, but Amina just tipped her face up, laughing. Min-jun, watching her, didn't call for an umbrella. He wheeled closer to the ancient plum tree, its branches now thick with green leaves, offering a partial canopy. "Come here," he said. She joined him under the tree's shelter. The rain pattered a gentle rhythm on the leaves above, a curtain of diamonds around them. The world smelled of wet earth and promise. He looked at her, rainwater glistening in her braids, her eyes bright. "You have rebuilt my home," he said, the roar of the waterfall feature not yet installed a silent echo between them. "No," she said, shaking her head, a droplet falling from her nose. "I've just made sure the doors are open. You're the one who had to decide to walk through them." He reached out then, not in a moment of high drama or defense, but in a moment of pure, quiet connection. He took her hand, his thumb stroking over her knuckles, still calloused from the garden work. It was a touch of acknowledgement, of partnership, of a bond that had grown in the rich soil of shared truth and mutual effort. "I choose to," he said, his words as clear as the rain-washed air. "Every day I choose to." The bridge was no longer unseen. It was here, in the widened paths, in the shared blueprints, in the clasp of their hands under the sheltering tree. It was solid. It was real. And it was built, stone by stone, choice by choice, together. The garden was complete. The unseen bridge was now a living, breathing heart within the estate. The plum tree, once skeletal, stood in a halo of flowering ground cover. The raised water feature murmured a constant, peaceful song. The wide flagstone paths invited wandering, and the accessible benches offered rest with a view. It was a masterpiece of shared vision, a testament to the language they had forged, a dialect of soil, stone, and silent understanding. Their hands, once hesitant, now found each other easily, brushing while passing a tool, resting together on the arm of his chair as they reviewed a plant's progress. Their hugs, still born of deep emotion rather than casual habit, were shelters. A quick, tight embrace after he successfully navigated a tricky business negotiation. A long, wordless hold when she received news of a childhood friend's engagement, the bittersweet ache of a life moving on while hers had taken such an uncharted turn. Each one was a brick in their new, real home. It was on a crystalline autumn morning, with the maple trees in the garden blazing like fire, that Assistant Choi presented Amina with a formal document alongside her morning tea. The cover was innocuous: financial summary and contractual closure. Her heart stopped. She knew what it was before she opened it. Inside, the math was laid out with brutal clarity. Every debt of her father's, the house, the medical bills, the business loans, was marked paid in full. A separate, generous trust established in her name as stipulated, was listed with its current balance. And there, highlighted, was Clause 7.b. Upon fulfillment of all financial obligations under Section 3, and after a period of no less than 24 months, either party may initiate a dissolution of the matrimonial agreement with 30 days written notice. The 24 months were up next week. The paper trembled in her hands. This was the promised exit. The off-ramp. The moment she had fantasized about in her first lonely weeks in the gilded cage. Freedom. A return to her old life, her own dreams, unencumbered. But the thought now tasted like ash. The old life was a ghost. The woman who had signed that contract was a stranger. The dream she had now, of watching this garden change with the seasons, of hearing his low laugh in the sunroom, of feeling the steady, solid comfort of his arms, were all inextricably woven with him. With Min-jun. Not the trillionaire, not the crippled heir, but the man who remembered his mother's music, who defended her with a fury that scorched the boardroom, who looked at her garden designs as if they were blueprints for a new world. She was no longer a creditor in the ledger of her life. She was an investor. And her heart was all in. A parallel realization, cold and terrible, gripped her. He would let her go. It was the final, brutal logic of the man he used to be. He had honored the contract to the letter. He would see her freedom as the last, owed payment. He would believe, in some deep, scarred part of himself, that it was the only honorable thing to do. That she would, of course, choose to leave. Tears she couldn't explain blurred the perfect figures on the page. She spent the day in a haze, moving through the beautiful rooms that had become home, each one a memory. The library where they'd had their first real conversation. The morning room where they shared quiet breakfasts. The storm-dark study where he'd shown her his wounds. The garden, their garden, where every bud and stone spoke of collaboration. She couldn't stay. Not like this, waiting for him to perform the final, heartbreaking act of a contract he'd already emotionally voided. She had to make the choice first. To show him that the terms had changed. Packing was a surreal agony. She didn't take the designer clothes, the jewels. She folded her old paint-splattered jeans, her sunflower sweater. She carefully placed her portfolio of garden designs, now filled with sketches of the unseen bridge, on top. This was all she was taking. The self she had come with and the self she had become. She booked a flight for 2 days' time. She would go to Chicago, see her father, and then, she didn't know. The future was a blank, gray wall. On her last evening, she walked through the garden one final time in the twilight, saying a silent goodbye to every plant, every stone they'd chosen together. Her heart felt like a physical weight dragging her down. She returned to her suite to find her door ajar. Inside, in the center of the room, was not Min-jun, but something that stole her breath. On the floor sat a single, ceramic planting pot. In it was a slender, delicate sapling of a royal star magnolia, its bare branches promising breathtaking spring blossoms. And tucked into the soil was not a formal document, but a simple, handwritten note on his personal stationery. Her hands shook as she picked it up. His handwriting was bold, precise, but the words were not. Amina. The contract stipulated a garden. It said nothing about the roots. The only ledger that matters to me now is the one where I count the days you choose to stay. The first entry begins tomorrow. With hope. Please choose to stay. Min-jun. A sob escaped her, part grief, part overwhelming, terrifying joy. He wasn't letting her go. He was asking. Not as a businessman but as a man. He was offering not a cage but a choice. And he was waiting, vulnerable, for her answer. She didn't need to think. She dropped her suitcase, the note clutched to her chest, and ran. She found him not in his study or the east wing, but in their garden, beneath their plum tree, lit by the soft glow of the path lights he had designed. He was simply sitting, waiting, his face a landscape of quiet dread and desperate hope. She didn't speak. She walked to him, sank to her knees in the cool grass before his chair, and took his face in her hands. Tears streamed down her cheeks. Yes, she whispered, the word a vow, a beginning, an end to all the old ledgers. My choice is yes. And as he pulled her into an embrace that felt like coming home, a hug of relief, of commitment, of a future uncharted and utterly theirs, the last of the walls dissolved not with a shout, but with a sigh. The contract was over. Their story was just beginning. 2 years bloomed and fell like the petals on the royal star magnolia, which now stood proudly at the entrance of the walled garden, a testament to the choice made in the soft glow of path lights. The estate was no longer a showcase of sterile perfection, but a living, breathing home. The changes were subtle to an outsider's eye, but profound to those who lived within. Ramps and pathways were simply part of the landscape, as natural as the hills themselves. The east wing was no longer a restricted zone. It housed Min-jun's brilliant, chaotic labs, but its door was always open, and Amina's vibrant abstract paintings now hung alongside blueprints for sustainable city designs. Amina's landscape firm, Unseen Bridge Designs, had its offices in a renovated gardener's cottage on the estate grounds. Her first major project had been a public park in Seoul, a revolutionary green space celebrated for its breathtaking beauty and its seamless, invisible accessibility. The plaque at its entrance read, "A place for all to grow." It was a philosophy that had begun in a forgotten garden and now touched a city. She was no longer known as the mysterious Mrs. Park, but as Amina Park Johnson, a visionary in her own right. Their public image was one of formidable partnership. They attended galas and groundbreaking ceremonies, a united front of quiet power. The world saw the trillionaire and his brilliant wife, a love story that had blossomed from an arranged marriage into a corporate fairy tale. But the truth, the private, precious truth, was in the quiet moments. It was in the heated, loving debates over breakfast about native grass species versus drought-resistant hybrids. It was in the way he would wheel silently into her office, just to watch her work, a small smile playing on his lips. It was in the way she would rest her head on his shoulder as they read in the evening, her hand finding his without thought. Their hugs were the punctuation of their days, a good morning embrace by the coffee machine, a quick squeeze of solidarity before a difficult meeting, a long, deep holding at the end of the day that spoke of sanctuary found. The celebration for the second anniversary of the unseen bridge garden's completion was not a corporate event. It was a gathering of their true world, her father, Robert, healthy and beaming, Ji-hoon and his new wife, a handful of Min-jun's most trusted colleagues who had become friends, and the small loyal staff who had witnessed the transformation of the house and its occupants. Laughter echoed under strings of lanterns in the garden. The water feature sang its constant song. As the evening deepened and the guests mingled, Min-jun quietly motioned to Ji-hoon. A gentle hush fell as Min-jun wheeled himself to the center of the garden, to the heart of the bridge they had built. The spotlight was not on a stage, but on a patch of flagstone beneath the now majestic plum tree. Amina watched, her heart full of a simple, profound joy. She expected a toast, a word of thanks to their guests. Min-jun's voice, when he spoke, was clear and carried not the tone of a CO, but of a man laying his soul bare before his chosen family. 2 years ago, he began, his eyes finding Amina's through the gentle crowd, we celebrated the completion of these stones, these plants, this water. We called it a bridge. But I was a man who only understood structures I could engineer, equations I could solve. He paused, his gaze never leaving hers. I did not understand that the most vital bridge is not built from stone but from choice. It is built from the courage to be seen, truly seen in your brokenness and met not with pity but with an offer of soil. It is built from the strength to stand before vultures and redefine the word limitation. It is built from the daily, quiet decision to stay, and to build a home where before there was only a house. He reached into his jacket and pulled out not a piece of paper, but a small, worn leather notebook, her first garden journal from Chicago, the one she thought she'd lost. You built the first bridge, Amina, he said, his voice thickening. You built it with your hands in the dirt, with your defiance in the storm, with your heart when I showed you only my scars. You taught me that love is not a transaction in a ledger. It is the forever foundation upon which everything else, every success, every garden, every moment of peace, is built. He set the journal aside and took a small velvet box from his pocket. A gasp rippled through the crowd, but Amina saw only him. The first contract asked for 2 years of your life, he said, opening the box. Inside rested not a cold, perfect diamond, but a unique ring, a band of warm, hammered gold, set with a single raw emerald, like a fragment of a living leaf, beside a small, brilliant stone that caught the lantern light like a dewdrop. This one asks for every year you are willing to give. Not as a merger but as a partnership. Not as an arrangement but as a choice. Every single day. Again and again. He took a steadying breath. Amina Johnson, will you rebuild this contract with me? Will you renew your vow, not to a set of terms, but to a man who loves you more than any blueprint, any empire, any garden? Will you be my wife for real and for forever? Tears streamed freely down her face as she walked to him. She didn't hesitate. She went to her knees before him as she had that rain-soaked afternoon, as she had the night he asked her to stay. She took his face in her hands the way she had when she first said yes. Min-jun Park, she whispered, her voice trembling with certainty, I chose you when the contract ended. I choose you now. And I will choose you every day from this garden into forever. He slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit. As he pulled her into his arms, the garden erupted in cheers and joyful tears. But for them, the world narrowed to the solid beat of his heart against hers, to the familiar, forever shelter of his embrace. They held each other not as a performance for anyone, but as the living, breathing truth of their story. The shocking thing, as their friends and family would later say, wasn't the proposal or the ring or the tears. It was the profound, quiet love that was evident in every glance, every touch, every shared silence. It was the proof that the most unbreakable bonds are not found in perfect beginnings, but built, intentionally and with great care, stone by stone, choice by choice, on the forever foundation of a love that was truly seen.